Everyone thought my grandchildren adored me. That was the pretty picture. What no one noticed was how quickly affection can be trained into indifference when the wrong lessons are repeated often enough. I saw it first in the pauses, in the way their attention slid past me like I was part of the furniture. Useful, present, but not important. I'm a grandmother, yes, but I was also once the center of this family, and losing that place didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, in moments no one thought were worth correcting. My name is Margaret Collins, and I'm 72 years old. I raised my son, Ryan, mostly on my own after his father passed away. I worked long hours, saved every extra dollar, and taught him the kind of values you don't learn from books. Respect. Gratitude. The understanding that you don't step on the people who carried you when you were still finding your balance. When Ryan married Laura, I welcomed her without hesitation. I meant it. I believed that if you give kindness freely, it comes back around. That belief is what carried me into their house after my fall 2 winters ago, when the doctor suggested I shouldn't live alone anymore and Ryan insisted I move in. He said it would be good for the kids to have their grandmother close. Ava was 8 then. Ethan had just turned 6. I thought it sounded right. In public, Laura played her role perfectly. At school functions or in neighborhood gatherings, she stood close to me, her hand light on my arm, her voice warm. Margaret helps so much, she'd say, like I was a gift she appreciated. People smiled at her. They nodded at me. Behind closed doors, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting. No insults you could point to. Just a steady narrowing of space. She corrected how I did things, always with a sigh that landed heavier than the words themselves. She rearranged what I'd already organized and reminded me, gently but firmly, that her way was more efficient. She laughed softly when the kids ignored me and brushed it off with, "They're just being kids," as if respect was optional and age automatically disqualified me from expecting it. At first, Ava still climbed into my lap with her books, and Ethan brought me his drawings. Then the comments started, casual and consistent, like background noise no one bothers to turn down. "Don't bother Grandma, she gets tired." "Let Grandma rest, she can't really keep up." The kids heard it all. They learned fast. Gradually, they stopped asking me questions. They stopped waiting for my answers. When I spoke, they didn't always look up. It wasn't sudden. That's what made it harder to fight. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself not to make trouble. Keeping peace felt like the mature thing to do. Ryan didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to. He worked long days and came home worn down, shoulders slumped, mind already somewhere else. Once, carefully, I mentioned how the kids were starting to speak to me. He smiled like I'd worried him over nothing. "Mom, you're reading too much into it. Laura says they're just joking." That was the moment I understood how alone my position was. I didn't bring it up again. I didn't want to become the story everyone whispered about, the old woman who couldn't adjust to her son's new life. The disrespect didn't explode. It settled in. It showed up in small refusals and uncorrected tones. Ethan stopped saying please. Ava corrected me in a voice that wasn't playful at all, repeating phrases that hadn't come from her own thinking. Once, when I asked her to pass the salt, she didn't respond at all. Laura was right there. She didn't look up from her phone. She didn't correct her daughter. She simply smiled at me, the kind of smile that made it clear there would be no support coming from her side of the table. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, my hands folded in my lap, realizing this wasn't about children testing boundaries. It was about boundaries being quietly removed. I still cooked dinner most evenings and helped where I was needed, but my place in the house shifted. I wasn't authority, and I wasn't quite family anymore either. I was help. The kind you don't think because you start to believe it's your right. When guests came over, Laura praised me like a responsibility she handled well. "We take care of Margaret," she'd say, loud enough for me to hear. I smiled, because that's what I'd always done. Inside, something steadied. Not anger. Awareness. One afternoon, I overheard Ava talking to Ethan near the hallway. "You don't have to listen to Grandma," she said easily. "Mom says she doesn't really get how things work now." Ethan laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was learned laughter. That was the moment I felt my place shrinking, inch by inch. Not because they were mean, but because they were being taught who mattered and who didn't. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't raise my voice or demand respect. That was never going to work here. Instead, I started paying attention in a different way. I noticed that Laura's corrections always happened in front of the kids. I noticed how she laughed off their behavior when it suited her and encouraged it when it didn't cost her anything. I noticed how Ryan trusted the image of harmony more than the reality unfolding under his roof. I realized my silence made things easier. Just not for me. So I changed quietly. I stopped filling every gap before it was noticed. I stopped fixing things without being asked. I answered when spoken to, calmly, and I didn't chase affection that wasn't offered. When Ava spoke sharply to me one evening, I looked at her and said, evenly, "That's not how we speak to people," and then I walked away. No lecture. No explanation. The room felt different after that. Laura noticed. I could see it in the way she watched me more closely, as if trying to understand what I was doing without giving her anything she could argue with. The house grew quiet in a way that made people careful with their footsteps. The kids moved through the rooms like they were waiting for instructions. I kept my routines. I kept my dignity. I spent more time outside, talking to neighbors who still asked how I was and waited for my answer. One of them, Mrs. Harris, mentioned casually that the kids never said hello anymore. I smiled and said, "They're learning." The words stayed with me long after I went back inside. That night, lying in bed, I understood something clearly. Disrespect doesn't start loud. It starts small, repeated, and tolerated. It grows in silence. And it only stops when someone decides they are done accepting it. I wasn't angry. I was awake. They still told people I was lucky. That was the phrase Laura liked to use. Lucky to live with family. Lucky to be helped. Lucky to be included. She said it with a smile that played well in public and landed differently at home. I began to notice how often that word came up whenever I tried to do something for myself, as if independence were a flaw I needed to outgrow. Part of me wanted to believe it. After all, I was under their roof. Ryan paid the mortgage. Laura ran the household like a tight schedule you didn't question if you wanted things to stay smooth. So I adjusted. That had always been my strength. I adjusted my habits, my expectations, even my voice. I spoke softer. I waited longer. I learned the rhythm of the house the way you learn traffic patterns, knowing when to move and when to stay still. What I didn't expect was how quickly silence becomes permission. Once the kids understood there were no real consequences, their behavior sharpened. Ava started rolling her eyes when I reminded her of simple manners. Ethan learned to interrupt me mid-sentence, finishing my thoughts in a mocking tone he thought was funny. Laura never stopped them. Sometimes she laughed, not loud, just enough to signal approval. Other times she corrected them in front of guests and let it slide when no one else was watching. The contrast was so clean it almost impressed me. Ryan drifted further into his routines. Work, phone, sleep. When he was present, he was tired. When he was tired, he didn't want problems. Laura knew that. She timed everything around it. If I spoke up in the morning, she'd say we could talk later. Later never came. If I tried in the evening, Ryan would sigh and say, "Mom, can we not do this right now?" The message was clear. My discomfort was inconvenient. Money became another quiet boundary. My retirement check went into a joint account for household expenses. That was the practical thing to do, Laura said. Easier for everyone. When I asked about buying a new coat after mine tore, she suggested waiting until next month. When Ava needed new shoes, Laura ordered them the same afternoon. No argument. No explanation. Just priority. I noticed how often my needs could wait while everyone else's were urgent. Food told its own story. Portions changed. My preferences were forgotten. "We didn't know you still liked that," Laura would say, even though I'd been making the same breakfast for 20 years. Sometimes there was nothing left when I came into the kitchen late. "I thought you weren't hungry," she'd shrug. It wasn't cruelty. It was control disguised as oversight. And, because it never looked intentional, it was easy for others to dismiss. The kids picked up on that too. They started helping themselves to my things. My chair. My books. Once, Ethan took my glasses and ran down the hall laughing while Ava cheered him on. When I asked for them back, Laura called out, "Kids, stop messing around," without moving from the couch. They ignored her. Eventually, I retrieved them myself. Laura smiled and said, "See? Everything worked out." I said nothing. I was done correcting small things that were no longer small. What changed me wasn't a single incident. It was accumulation. It was the way my name was used more often as a reference than a person. Grandma won't mind. Grandma can do it. Grandma doesn't need much. Each phrase shaved something off me. Not enough to draw blood. Enough to change the shape. One afternoon, the school called about Ava's pickup schedule. Laura wasn't home, and the secretary asked if I could come instead. When I mentioned it later, Laura frowned. "Next time, let me handle it," she said. "It just confuses people." I looked at her, really looked, and realized how practiced that dismissal was. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult me. She simply erased me from roles I was still capable of filling. That evening, I sat on the back porch with Mrs. Harris again. She asked, casually, how I liked living with my son. I paused longer than usual before answering. "I'm learning," I said. She studied my face for a moment and nodded like she understood more than I'd said. That was the first time an outsider's quiet acknowledgement hit me harder than anything happening inside the house. It made something settle. From then on, I watched with intention. I noticed patterns instead of reacting to moments. Laura corrected me only in front of the kids. Ryan defended her only when he felt accused. The children tested boundaries only where they knew none existed. I stopped filling the silence with explanations. I stopped smoothing over tension. I let pauses stretch. It made people uncomfortable. That wasn't my problem anymore. When Ava snapped at me during homework one night, I didn't argue. I closed the book and said, "We'll try again later." Laura looked up surprised. The kids stared at me, waiting for the usual lecture or retreat. I gave them neither. I went to my room and closed the door. For the first time, I felt the house adjust around me instead of the other way around. Ryan knocked later. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. It wasn't a lie. I was clearer than I'd been in months. He hesitated. Like he wanted to ask more, then said he was glad. He didn't see the shift yet. That was fine. Some lessons need space before they make sense. That night, I wrote a list. Not accusations. Observations. Dates. Small details. Not for revenge. For truth. I understood something then that I wish I'd learned sooner. Silence can be endurance, or it can be strategy. I had done enough enduring. What came next would be quieter, steadier, and entirely on my terms. People still smiled at Laura when they saw us together. That part never changed. At church, at school meetings, even at the grocery store, she'd touch my arm lightly and say, "This is my mother-in-law, Maggie. We're so lucky to have her." The way she said lucky always landed like a period, not an invitation. Folks nodded, some even said I was blessed. I nodded back because correcting strangers felt pointless. What mattered was how different the air felt once the front door closed behind us, like a switch flipping from warm to sterile. After that night with the homework book, something subtle shifted in the house. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was more like a pause in a song you've heard too many times. Laura started watching me the way I'd been watching her, trying to figure out what changed. Ryan noticed it too, even if he couldn't name it. He'd look up from his phone when conversation stalled, then shrug it off, saying work had been brutal and he was wiped. That word came up a lot. Wiped. Like exhaustion excused everything. I stopped offering to help before being asked. Not out of spite, just clarity. When dinner ran late, I waited. When laundry piled up, I folded only my own. Laura didn't comment at first. She tested the silence, maybe expecting me to fill it like I used to. When I didn't, she picked up the slack with exaggerated sighs, glancing toward Ryan like she was keeping score. He missed it every time. Or chose to. The kids adjusted faster than the adults. Ava stopped assuming my yes. She asked more often, watching my face like she was recalibrating. Ethan tried pushing once, reaching for my chair again, then hesitated when I didn't move. He laughed it off, said he was kidding. I smiled back, calm as ever. He didn't try again that week. Children understand boundaries before they understand explanations. What surprised me most was how much space opens up when you stop shrinking yourself. I slept better. My appetite came back. I started taking my walks earlier, before anyone else was awake, the neighborhood quiet except for sprinklers and the occasional jogger. Mrs. Harris waved from her porch one morning and asked if everything was okay at home. She said it casually, like she was asking about the weather. I told her yes, just slower this time. She nodded again, the same way she had before, like she knew timing mattered. Laura started tightening things in small ways. The joint account was suddenly under review. She needed receipts, she said, just to stay organized. I handed them over without comment. When my prescription refill was late, she said the pharmacy must have messed up. I called myself and fixed it in 10 minutes. She looked annoyed, not relieved. That told me more than any argument could have. Ryan tried once to smooth things over. He said I seemed distant lately. Asked if he'd done something wrong. I told him no, that I was just tired of explaining myself. He laughed lightly and said, "That's everyone, Mom." Then he kissed my forehead and went back to his screen. That was the moment I understood something hard and clean. He wasn't choosing sides. He was choosing ease. The real shift came on a Tuesday afternoon that felt ordinary until it wasn't. Laura had volunteered to bring snacks for a school event and forgot. The school called the house and I answered. The secretary asked if someone could drop them off. I said I could. When I arrived, Laura's name was already on the sign-up sheet, bold letters next to empty boxes. The secretary smiled politely and said, "We were worried." I said nothing bad about my daughter-in-law. I didn't need to. I just handed over the snacks and signed my own name beneath Laura's, small but legible. Later that evening, Laura confronted me in the kitchen. Her voice was low, controlled. She said I should have called her first. I looked at her and said, just as calm, that the school needed help and I was available. Ryan sat at the table pretending to read something on his phone. Laura waited for him to step in. He didn't. The silence stretched. This time, she filled it with a tight smile and said we'd talk later. We never did. From then on, things unraveled faster, though no one would have called it chaos. It was more like threads loosening. Laura forgot things more often. Missed details she used to manage flawlessly. She blamed stress, then blamed time, then blamed everyone else. I watched, noted patterns, didn't correct her. At church, she complained to a friend about how hard it was managing everything alone. The friend looked at me with sympathy. I met her eyes and smiled. No denial. No defense. Just presence. Ryan started noticing questions he hadn't before. Why the account statements looked different. Why school emails mentioned my name. Why the kids asked me things they used to ask Laura. He didn't accuse. He just asked. Laura answered quickly, sometimes too quickly. The rhythm was off. Even he could hear it. One night, after the kids were asleep, Ryan asked me if I was happy living there. It wasn't a dramatic question. He sounded genuinely curious, like he'd just thought of it. I told him I was learning what happiness looked like at this stage of my life. He frowned, said he didn't understand. I told him he would, eventually. That was the first time he looked uneasy instead of annoyed. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. That was new. I understood now that the middle of any long story isn't about action. It's about alignment. About deciding what you will no longer absorb. Laura hadn't lost control yet. She just didn't realize it was slipping. And Ryan hadn't woken up fully. He was still stretching, eyes half open, confused by the light. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because some truths need room to surface on their own. And I had all the time in the world to wait. By the time people started noticing something was off, Laura had already convinced herself it was temporary. Stress, she said. A phase. Anyone would crack juggling kids, work, a household, and an aging parent under one roof. She said all this out loud, usually to friends, sometimes to Ryan, often with a laugh that sounded a little too rehearsed. I stayed out of those conversations. Not because I didn't hear them, but because I understood something she didn't yet. Explanations lose power when the pattern speaks for itself. The house had a new rhythm. Laura moved faster, talked sharper, corrected the kids more often. Ava flinched once when Laura snapped about shoes by the door, then glanced at me like she was checking which version of the world we were in that day. Ethan started lingering near my chair in the evenings, not asking for anything, just existing close. I'd rest my hand on his back without a word. Laura noticed. Her eyes always flicked there, then away, like she didn't want to admit what it meant. Ryan tried to compensate in small, awkward ways. He brought home takeout more often, said he didn't want anyone cooking. He suggested a family movie night and fell asleep halfway through. He asked Laura if she was okay, then accepted her quick yes like a receipt he didn't bother to read. When he asked me the same question, I told him I was fine. That wasn't a lie. It was a line drawn quietly under my feet. The school emails kept coming, and now they CC me by default. Laura missed another pickup time and blamed traffic. The office staff smiled politely when I arrived instead, like they'd been expecting me. One of the teachers mentioned how calm Ava seemed lately, how focused. She said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I nodded, said kids thrive on consistency. Laura stood beside me, smiling tight, her jaw working like she was chewing something tough. At church, Laura volunteered for less and complained about it more. People still praised her, still told her she was amazing. I watched their faces change when she forgot names, mixed up dates, asked the same question twice. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for doubt to settle in. I didn't add to it. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require backup singers. One afternoon, Mrs. Harris stopped me on my walk and asked if I'd be willing to help her organize a small neighborhood fundraiser. She said I seemed reliable. That word landed heavy and kind all at once. I agreed. Laura found out later and asked why I hadn't told her. I said it hadn't come up. She stared at me, searching for tone, for attitude, for something she could grab onto. There was nothing there. Just a woman who no longer needed permission. The money question surfaced again, this time from Ryan. He noticed a late fee on an account Laura insisted she'd handled. She brushed it off, said the bank messed up. He didn't argue, but he didn't let it go either. He checked the statement himself. I saw him reading it at the table, his brow folding in on itself. Laura talked through it, over it, around it. He listened, nodding slowly, like he was assembling a picture with missing pieces. That night, Laura confronted me more directly than she had in months. She said I was undermining her, that people were starting to get the wrong idea. I asked her what idea that was. She paused, then said she didn't know. That answer hung between us, heavy and unfinished. Ryan watched from the hallway, pretending not to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I just said I was living my life honestly and left the room. For the first time, Laura had nothing to respond with. The kids sensed the shift before the adults named it. Ava asked if I'd come to her next school event instead of her mom. Ethan started bringing his homework to me without being told. Laura corrected them once, sharply, then stopped. She looked tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. Control takes energy, especially when it's slipping. At the fundraiser, people thanked me openly. They said things like dependable and steady. Laura showed up late, flustered, and tried to take charge. The group smiled politely and kept following my lead. I didn't gloat. I didn't apologize. I just did the work. When it was over, Mrs. Harris hugged me and said, "You've been holding things together for a long time, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Ryan drove home quiet that night. Halfway there, he said he felt like he'd missed something important these past few years. I told him most people do. It wasn't an accusation. It was a truth said gently. He nodded, eyes on the road, jaw tight. Laura stared out the window, arms crossed, silent for once. I knew then that the ground had shifted enough to be felt. Not collapsed. Not broken. Just changed. Laura was no longer the narrator of our story. Ryan was starting to listen instead of assume. The kids were learning who felt safe. And I was done shrinking to make peace. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the reveal. It was the moment before, when the air goes still and everyone senses something is about to surface. I stayed calm, stayed present, because I understood now that dignity doesn't rush. It waits, steady and unbothered, until the truth has nowhere left to hide. Everyone thought the tension in our house would explode. That was the mistake. It didn't explode. It settled. And when something settles long enough, it shows its true shape. The final shift didn't come from an argument or a confrontation. It came from paperwork. Quiet, boring, undeniable paperwork. Ryan took a day off work to straighten out finances he'd been avoiding. A neighbor mentioning how stressed Laura always seemed, how she talked about carrying everyone on her back. Ryan started hearing versions of his life that didn't match what he saw at home. The final exposure came without drama. At a family gathering, someone joked about how lucky I was to be so well taken care of. Laura smiled, ready with her usual line. Before she could finish, Ryan said, casually, that we'd actually been sorting through some issues, and he was grateful I'd been so patient. The room went quiet, not awkward, just attentive. Laura's smile froze. She hadn't planned for honesty to show up like that, calm and public. Later that night, Ryan asked me to talk. Not to explain, not to complain, just to talk. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd adjusted to, what I'd stopped expecting. I didn't list grievances. I described patterns. I described how small decisions add up, how silence teaches people what they can get away with. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he was sorry, not as a reflex, but like someone who finally understood what the apology was for. Laura didn't take responsibility all at once. That would have required self-awareness she didn't have. She framed things as misunderstandings, stress, bad timing. But the power had shifted. Ryan handled the finances again. Decisions were discussed, not dictated. The kids watched carefully, learning new rules without anyone spelling them out. I made my own changes too. I accepted more responsibilities outside the house, commitments that belonged to me alone. I kept my routines. I took up space without asking. Laura struggled with that more than anything else. Not anger. Independence. The day I decided to move into a small apartment nearby, Ryan didn't argue. He helped me look at listings, helped me pack. Laura cried, but her tears were tangled in relief and loss, emotions she couldn't separate. The kids hugged me hard and promised to visit. I told them they didn't need permission to love people who made them feel safe. If you believe elders deserve respect, not silence, please like and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this get heard. Now, in my own quiet place, I wake up without bracing myself. I drink my coffee without listening for footsteps. I speak when I have something to say and stay silent when I choose to, not because I have to. Laura still tells people she did her best. Maybe she believes it. Ryan checks in more, listens more. The kids are growing into themselves, unafraid to ask questions. I didn't expose anyone with shouting or threats. I didn't need to. I learned that truth doesn't rush and dignity doesn't beg. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my value. And that was enough.